Hello and welcome to Gardener's World. As you can imagine, since you were last here, the garden has really kicked on, and I'm excited about spending the next hour and just showing you what's happened. Just editing a few of the poppies at the moment. I inherited them and have seeded all over the garden, and though I love them, at times they can be a little bit overpowering. So what I do is I just pull them out where I don't want them, where I want to keep them. I'll let them seed. But even with those seed heads, look, against that Clematis looks absolutely stunning. And as you can imagine with me, I do not sit down very much, so I'm planning to add new borders in the autumn. And this is a great way of helping you understand if you're going to do that in your own back garden. I've just left the grass to grow. That means that I can understand the balance between the larger border, the path, and this, and make that decision whether to make it any bigger or smaller before I commit to cutting it all out. But that's for another day. At the moment, I think it looks all right, and the wildlife are loving it. On today's programme, Eric travels to Germany to discover an incredible project where a disused industrial site has become the centrepiece of a tropical park.
Looking around at this is absolutely breathtaking.
Rachel visits Cliffsgate Court on the 100-year anniversary of this glorious garden.
It is absolutely beautiful, rather like falling into a box of chocolates and finding something delicious in every corner.
And I've got an idea for a dry, shady spot that I'm going to share with you. Plus I've got a friend to help me plant up a new area of edible flowers and herbs. The wisteria this year has been absolutely fantastic. Mind you saying that, it's never let us down since we moved in. It's been great. It started to flower again, which it's done every single year since we've lived here. So I'm not necessarily going to do all the pruning today, but when it comes to pruning, people worry a little bit too much. You pick up a book and you read it and it tells you if you don't prune something on the third Wednesday in March, the whole world is going to come to an end. And in reality, it doesn't. You might lose a season's flower. It's very rarely that you're going to kill something. I've got a little story that just bumbles around in my head when it comes to pruning with 7 and 2, boys, 7 and 2, which is quite simple to remember. It means on the 7th month you cut back to 7 buds, and then in the 2nd month, February, we cut back to 2 buds. But why do we do it? We're doing it this time of year to let more air in, to stop the plant going up through your gutters and surrounding the windows, but also letting that light and that air in will ripen buds that will form our flowers for next year. So all this growth has been put on in 1 year. So all I'm doing is looking at that old stem from last year and just counting out. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you're cutting just above that node. I'm doing it this way around so that the blade, my sharp bit, is nice and close to that bud, which means that you won't get dieback. It's just a general little pruning tip. There we go. 7. I think the next bit's going to need a ladder. And at this time of year as well, you might choose 1 or 2 beautiful stems that you think you could, wire those across the back of the house. Like I say, with this one, it's more about maintaining, really. I really enjoy this job. I just enjoy spending time with the wisteria. I think they're a majestic plant, At the moment, the new growth has got a wonderful coppery tone to it. But even when they lose their leaves, I love the fact that they look architectural. A question I get a lot when you're on the road is people saying, wisteria, I've bought one and it's not flowering. But the tip with that is when you're buying one is to buy a grafted one. And what I mean by that is you'll go into the garden centre. You look at the pot and about 6 inches up, you'll see the old stem going back down into that pot, and then it's attached from there. That old stem is old stock, so it speeds up, that flowering time. Even maybe buy one in flower. These things could take anything up to 7 to 16 years to flower. So grafted is a good way to go. So there you go, there's a little bit of that done. It's not a bad job to knock off each sections. So if you want to buy one, remember to get a grafted one. But the pruning, just remember 7 and 2, and you won't go far wrong. If there is another Clematis, and earlier on in the year, Nick looked at the spring flowering ones, which are group 1, and now he's off enjoying the summer flowering Clematis, which are the group 2.
This garden is packed with over 230 Clematis from across all 3 groups. But I'm here today to look at the summer flowering Group 2 Clematis. Compared to their spring flowering counterparts, Group 2 Clematis tend to have larger flowers, they're usually more compact, and they'll often repeat flower twice in the season. They really are the show-offs of the Clematis world. While Group 1 Clematis flower from February to May, Group 2 produce their main flush of flowers in May and June, and again, with a little help, later in summer. Clematis are well known for having quite specific cultural requirements. They generally like to have their tops up in the light, but the key bit is that their roots are cool and damp and shady. That might suggest to you that you can't grow them in pots, but actually, if you get a large enough pot, you can easily get away with it. So something of this scale works really well. Now, of course, you need to make sure it stays very damp and keep it really well fed. Now, this is a particularly beautiful Clematis. It's called Viva Polonia. It's got that lovely quality to it, very, very pale centre, which really makes it pop. If you look further down the plant, it's doing something quite interesting here. On this outer structure, it's starting to turn green, almost leaf-like. Let me explain why that is. So if you take a typical flower, say a rose, you've got very distinct floral structures. Around the outside here, you've got the sepals which form the bud or hold the petals up, and the petals in the centre. When botanists can't differentiate floral parts between being a sepal or a petal, they call it a tepal. And so what you see on Clematis are a series of tepals. They're not petals at all. They're quite different, and that's why they can revert and take on these green tones. They really are fascinating plants. This beauty is Clematis Bees Jubilee, and it really takes me back to when I was 16. I used to grow it in the nursery there, and hundreds of them I remember having to prise apart, so it's a really vigorous plant. Now, it first appeared in 1958, and it's got an award of garden merit, so that means it's tried, tested, and a good, healthy plant. What's lovely about it, very, very distinct. Now, it flowers for about 6 weeks in midsummer, and then it will repeat again in the autumn and around September time, so it gives you really good value. Just noticed a lovely idea in this garden tucked away behind me, and it's one of the best ways to make the most of the qualities of Group 2 Clematis. So there's a Rosa Graham Thomas at the back there. It's quite a large rose, and it's almost taken on climber qualities. And what happens with so many of the big climbing roses is they tend to have bare bases, stems with no foliage and no flowers. But by using a Group 2 under there, it's come up to about 2 metres, totally covered those ugly stems, and it's got the added bonus that those beautiful flowers of the Clematis associate fantastically with the rose. So it's a real double win. For all their glamour, Group 2 clematis can occasionally suffer a problem known as clematis wilt. What it essentially is a fungus which attacks the base of the stems, and it effectively knocks out their capacity to transport water through their xylem vessels. And that starts to manifest itself as these sort of darkened areas right next to the leaf petiole or the leaf stem. All you need to do is to cut the stems back hard, right down to ground level, or even lower. You can see there's fungal problems there. And what that should do is trigger the plant back into vigor, produce decent growth, and return to good health. The classic approach to pruning Group 2 clematis comes in 2 stages. So in late winter, it's all about removing dead, diseased and damaged stems back down to fat, healthy, juicy buds. But it's important that you leave that structure from last year, because of course Group 2 clematis, their first flush of flowers appears on last year's wood. Now this plant beside me has had its first flush and it's stopped flowering, so it's now time for the second prune, which will trigger another flowering which will go on through August and into September. The key way to do that is to remove about a third of the top older growth, and you can see all of this has finished flowering now, but what's making its way up are these stems, and they are going to be the ones that will flower later in the year. So just with a simple removal of this older growth, tying these back in, it will ensure great health and vigour and make sure these Group 2 clematis look fantastic.
Wonderful plants, aren't they? I think climbers are just going to become more and more important to our gardens. What do I mean by that? Our gardens are getting smaller. That means that boundary around the edge of your space is going to become more important. Climbers are vertical. They don't take up too much space, or even over an arbour or an archway. But I've not just been playing with the flowering plants, I've been playing with the edible climbers as well. Here I've got a thornless blackberry. Look at the stems, I can run my hands up and down. I've worked it against the wall, but this idea was born of something I saw my nan doing years ago. Outside the back of their house, they had this rough bit of ground, and on the edge of that rough bit of ground, blackberries grew. Instead of just leaving them, she got Grandad to bang in these posts and wire between them, and then she just tied them in. I can still remember her blackberry and apple pie. It was wonderful. But these growths are starting to take over the border a little bit. And if you imagine, I don't want them in the border, but at the same time, I don't want to lose them. These will become next year's fruit. So the old gardeners just used to put a cane up the middle and just tie them in. It's a little bit fiddly. Make sure you don't miss any. This is when you realise how wonderful they are, being thornless. And all I'm going to do is bunch that in to start with, tie it off. There we go. So when you've tied them in all right, they don't look wonderful at the moment, but the leaves will turn, so it'll look fine. But what you can see is I can get to the rest of the blackberries. So when they're gone, we'll cut it all away, and then we'll tie these in as a fan, and hopefully we'll be enjoying blackberry and apple pie next year. Come here, then. Come on. Where are you going? It's this way. Come on. Daft creature. The woodland area is coming along really well, but I don't think I'm the only person in the country with a spot in your garden that nothing will grow. And mine's there. It's a dry, shady area, and what makes it worse is the roots are near to the surface. But I've got a plan. So far what I've done is just create a mini planter, and the inspiration from that was born from that over there that's now covered in moss, and I just thought, wonder if I can recreate that all the way through the woodlands. I've got these old logs, and the centre is really rotted, so I've come up with this plan that if I can fill them with soil, that's then going to give me a real depth of soil to get the ferns going, and then I'll repeat that through the rest of the space. So all I'm going to do is sprinkle the soil back around the edges. So I'm firming this background. It's just regular soil from the woodland I dug out to start with. Because my soil is so limey, and quite a lot of woodlanders do like a slightly more acid soil, I could, introduce slightly more acid-loving plants. That will stop any of my compost escaping, and these are really setting well. What's lovely though, straight away, the tiny crevices that are left, you know that they're going to create fantastic habitat, not just for the plants, but for the animals as well. So the next thing is I get my mix in and get those plants in. Is that right? Yes, come on in. So, what I've done here is create myself a mix that is some of the woodland soil that's come straight out of that hole, but I've added some composted bark and some peat-free compost, and the ferns, which I'm going to grab from there, will absolutely love it. So, really simple now. All I'm going to do is put my mix into my log container. I'm not over firming it, but I'm just making sure that it's gone into some of those sort of hollows inside. And now, these are Dryopteris, which are a lovely, quite a hard working fern really. I've got other varieties right across this area, so we just loosen some of those roots up and simply plant it in. Like that in. There we go, just firm those in. I know these ferns have been chosen because they'll deal with the drier conditions. They'll grow to about a metre plus in time, but what I have done is I've improved those conditions, and I know that actually that will keep a reasonable amount of moisture in there, because not only will the soil contain it, but also those logs will as well, and the plants can draw on it. And I think that repeated through the space will work really well. Composting around the roots, and away that plant will go. I think that all of us want to improve our gardens and the landscape around us, and Harriet has been to Germany to visit a park that does it on a huge scale.
In the UK, we're used to seeing abandoned and industrial buildings and factories in our cities and countryside, no longer relevant and left to decay. With green spaces more precious than ever, I was excited to hear about a revolutionary idea that is embracing these remnants of our past, placing them centre stage once more, and crucially, developing new parks and gardens around them, bringing nature closer to us. I've come to Germany to find a place that has inspired designers around the world and has become a benchmark for regeneration and how we can create spaces that allow nature to merge into our built environments. This is Landshark Park, Duisburg Nord, in Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley. Opened 25 years ago, it's a public park that was built on the old decaying ironworks. With its woodland and gardens stretching across 400 acres of land, it's home to over 700 species of plants. And over 1 million visitors come here every year to walk, cycle, rock climb, and enjoy cultural events. I cannot believe the scale of it. Wow. Looking around at this park is absolutely breathtaking. Everywhere you look, there are trees and greenery, but sprinkled in amongst that, there's walking paths and the canal and bike routes, but rising up right in the middle are these blast furnaces. They absolutely dominate this space. The Thyssen Ironworks operated between 1901 and 1985, providing employment for 2,300 workers at any one time. You've got to remember, this place was purely about function, the purpose of creating iron ore. Looking at it from this perspective, I can start to see a real design aesthetic here, because one of the principles is concrete, there's the metalwork of the structures, and that in itself gives a really strong sense of place. These used to be old bunkers that would store the raw materials such as limestone and iron ore, but now they've been repurposed for the public to come and enjoy, so they've become playgrounds and even gardens. This whole site has been repurposed with people and nature in mind. Now, these smaller bunkers have been put to such good use, I feel, because they're actually like mini walled gardens, and I really love how, because they're south-facing, they've been given this Mediterranean planting feel. So things like the Santolina smiling at me, and the lavender and the gaura in the breeze. I mean, from this platform, it's a beautiful viewing station because you can't actually get into these ones, but I do know that the volunteers come up here and really enjoy working through these spaces. And why wouldn't you? Because they're absolutely lovely. These are actually quite small in amongst the madness and the chaotic size of this place. This is one that you can come in and enter, and it's actually the closest to what we'd know as a traditional garden, with this yew hedging and the layout of the hydrangeas. It's very much like a parterre garden. It's got a strong form which sits well within the landscape, but it has a seat, and I think that it enables you to come in, sit down and just contemplate the whole space. Vision to transform this industrial wasteland into a green oasis is landscape architect Peter Latz. Where did your vision come from to retain the history of this site?
There's one official story of the Ruhr region, but if you look more closely, there are actually thousands of stories which are all very different. I think this is similar in the industrial areas of England. This place gives these stories from the past room to be told. We created this garden with formal. We gathered all the materials that were here on the site and collected them into these raised beds. So all the parts were visible, and the families were very happy to be involved.
25 years on, is this park now the real vision that was in your head and heart?
Yes, absolutely. Whether it's a blessing or a curse, in this profession, you have to wait 25 years for the plans to come to fruition.
It was worth the wait. Peter has taken an old industrial relic which holds the memories of the past and created something new for future generations. I love it round here. Sound of birdsong, all of this nature that's crept in and smashed itself right up against a man-made environment, just how it should be. I can't wait to see how much more this place has to offer.
It really is a mind-blowing park, but we'll be going back to Arit a little bit later to see exactly how. Mother Nature is reclaiming that industrial site. Anyway, you might be wondering who these two are. We had some sad news more or less a week after we last filmed here as we lost Tom. She sadly passed away. And very quickly the house seemed like a strange place without a cat. So Mrs. Frost and the kids decided to go and get their hands on these two monkeys. This is Ash and this is Willow. I just hope they enjoy the garden as much as they do their food. Anyway, still to come on today's programme. Rachel explores the magnificent Kifsgate Garden in Gloucestershire.
It is spectacular when it's in flower like this, sort of a waterfall of white heads.
It's just a sort of glorious monster.
But first we catch up with Frances, our allotment in Kent, to see how she's getting on.
Over the last few months, I have been lucky enough to visit some incredible allotments all over the country. But now I'm back on my home turf to show you how things are coming along. Bloomed into summer, the allotment started to flourish. The shed has had a lick of paint. Even with the very cold start we had, not to mention the storms, the plants and flowers bloomed into life. My greenhouse is slowly filling up, but I'll show you that later, and the cut flower bed is coming on really nicely. The rest of the allotment is looking much more lush than it was, and there's loads of lovely red currants, black currants, gooseberries, and a huge rhubarb as well. But I've also planted some other bits of my own. There's sunflowers, got potatoes, sweet corn, beans, courgettes, leeks, lots of things. But the one thing that just keeps on growing that I do not want is the weeds. Now, when I first got here, I had two major weeds that I found, horsetail and couch grass, and I found the couch grass fairly easy to control. Just dig it all up, and where it comes back now, it's just, again, another dig, and you can see the rhizomes. It's fairly simple. The horsetail just keeps coming back. But what I did do was rotivate in the end. I started digging the whole thing. It took absolutely ages, and then the growing season was fast approaching and I was running out of time, so I rotivated the bits I hadn't already dug. And actually there's not too big a difference in the bits that were hand dug and the bits that were rotivated. But what I'm doing now, this is my herb bed, which I'm really pleased with actually. It just needs a regular weed. This will be the 4th time I've dug out the horsetail. It's just trying to get out as much of the roots as possible every time I dig it up from around the plants, and I hope that will weaken things. And as these plants get bigger, hopefully they'll then outcompete the horsetail, but I think I'll be here for some years. And what I have found is that where my manure pile was, there's much less horsetail growing through, so I think next year I'm going to do no dig, mulch it with compost and manure, and hope that helps as well. The path to a beautiful allotment never does run smooth, and a few weeks ago I discovered another problem. Another windy day on the allotment, and I've arrived this morning to my herb bed, my medicinal herb bed this one is, to find the rabbits have been munching. They've not eaten any of the lavender, but they've just chopped it all off, and they've completely eaten my chamomile. So I think some rabbit-proof fencing is required. I have to admit, I did shed a tear when the rabbits got to all my lovely herbs. But within a few days, I got my plot fenced and safe from hungry bunnies. Now, last time round, there was one thing that got everyone very excited. Bird scarer. Actually, I do need to do this because my strawberries are ripening, my blueberries are about to ripen, and my next door neighbour Ian has shown me how to do it because he has them all over his plot. So all it is a plastic bottle, recycled, and I've just cut some lines down it. And then, with a piece of thick wire, you throw it through a hole in the bottom, keep the lid on, a hole in the lid, and then bend that top bit over. And you just push the bottom up, and bend the bottom bit. And then, just a bit of tape to keep that in the right position. There you can see the shapes sort of beginning to form. Once they're all taped on, you just cut that wire down and stick it in the top of a bamboo cane. Put that in the ground, and there, a little windmill made out of an old bottle. And hopefully that will keep the birds off my fruits. But it's the herbs that are one of my favourite things about the allotment, and I have them growing all over the place. Not just edible herbs, but ones that have multiple uses. Very much inspired by visiting the amazing cosmetic allotment on the Isle of Man. And here, I've got things like bergamot, which is said to reduce fever and aid digestion, feverfew, which can help headaches, and rose, which is a bit of a wonder plant. It's thought to be anti-inflammatory, antiseptic, and good for anxiety. I'm also putting in these calendula that Tanya gave me when I was in the Isle of Man visiting her cosmetic allotment. So there's plenty here. But what I'm really excited about is this. This is African bulbine. Now, it's not hardy, so this will have to come in the winter, but it's an amazing medicinal herb. It's a bit like an aloe, very fleshy leaves, and the gel inside that is really, really good for skincare, burns, and things like that. Hopefully this will be very happy here because it's a really sandy soil, so it doesn't get waterlogged, and it will bake really hot in the sun here because there's no shade for it. So I'm hoping that as the summer goes on, the roots for that will get really big, and then when I dig it up in the autumn or the winter, I can put it in a really big, lovely pot. My old salvaged greenhouse has been edible produce. It's a really nice shelter from the wind for the plants, but also for me sometimes. But it's lovely to have the chance to grow some more exotic things. So I have some Vietnamese coriander, kaffir lime, sweet potatoes, and I have found that my nasturtiums, for some reason, don't like it outside here. So they're all growing in here as well. I've still got more allotments to visit over the coming months, and I can't wait to meet yet more inspirational growers. It's just a case of finding the time to try all these ideas out on my own plot. But in the meantime, I have plenty here to keep me busy.
Growing your own can get really busy, so I'm delighted Francis has found some time to stop by and give me a hand with a new project. It's lovely to have you here.
It's lovely being here. It's gorgeous, isn't it?
I know, see, I keep telling everyone it's work in progress, you know.
This is incredible what you've done.
Yeah, sure. What about the allotment? Enjoying that? It looks really good.
Yeah, it's going well. I mean, we had quite a lot of rain, but now it's incredibly dry, so I'm down there watering as much as I can, and the sand obviously leaches away, but I'm beginning to harvest stuff now, so it's getting exciting. And I've got some courgettes coming. I harvested my first cucumber yesterday and ate it as I was watering.
Yeah.
You know, it's just magical.
Yeah, I love the experimenting and just accepting some things go well, some things don't. You know?
Yeah, quite a lot of things don't when you're in that much wind. But yeah, no, I had my nephew down there yesterday harvesting our first potatoes, and everyone that came up, he was going, "Oh, it's magic, isn't it? We're heroes." And it's like, it is like magic seeing them all come up.
Talking about the Ben's garden, though.
Yeah.
Can I show you?
Absolutely, yeah. Please do.
This is it.
It's beautiful. Look at this.
I'm a bit nervous showing you, actually.
Oh, really?
Like,
Oh,
it's a
don't.
bit weird,
I'm
isn't it?
learning about veg as well. It's not my natural thing, so it's. I'm quite envious.
Yeah, but that is part of it, isn't it? Experimenting and even when I was designing it, I wanted to sort of experiment with size of beds and things like that.
Because that's beautiful. Those metre square. It's a really practical use of veg. You know.
Could be a roof garden. So, this is today's little project.
It's lovely back here.
It's quite interesting because we've ended up using it a lot to come and be and cook
Right.
and enjoy it. So the idea is that we play with these 6 beds long term and make it more into sort of edible flowers, meats, herbs. So,
And this is what you're sort of planting?
yeah, got a whole mix really. So bits that we'll seed, like the borrages, Now we've got alignment there.
Lovely.
And again, I'm not worried about that if it overtakes one container, so
Yeah.
that doesn't matter. Even the lemon verbena.
Good in cocktails. Both of these.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, you said cocktails, so I make tea out
You
of
want
this.
tea? I'll have a cocktail. You can have a cup of tea. Look, I bought you something as well.
Have you?
Which is from the Allotment. So it's
bless you.
a little bit wind battered. This is Vietnamese coriander,
Yes,
so
lovely.
hopefully it'll fit in here.
But, right, so I've grown that before, but I've never really used it in the kitchen because I wasn't quite sure what to do with it.
Well, actually, it's nice in the salad because as you chew it, it starts off a bit,
Good. Can I?
dare I say, soapy. Go for
Right.
it. It's yours.
Yeah.
And the more you chew it, it gets a heat that builds and builds and builds. And although it's a little bit leggy, this one, because I've been yeah, has it hit you? A little bit spicy, a little bit hot. If you cut that back to where it's more bushy, stick all these in water and then they'll root in a couple of weeks, so you'll have loads and loads more. So it's quite good to fill up a
And
space
then I can
quickly.
take them away.
Exactly.
So, just grab some and
Okay.
start playing.
You're going to have to move them around if you're not happy with where I've put
Thing is,
them.
that's quite a lovely thing to do, really. You get to bounce off somebody and take someone else's opinion.
True.
This is a little perennial borage.
That's beautiful, that.
Yeah.
And you can eat the flowers from that just like with a normal borage.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
So this is lime mint.
Yeah, lime mint. Again, makes great tea.
And you've got the verbena there.
know.
Do you think that will survive the winter?
Yeah, I've got two at the front of the house. Absolutely fine.
Do you know when you just smell them, it releases all kinds of endorphins? They make you actually happy.
There you go. I could probably do with that.
Do you know the nice thing I found about the Vietnamese coriander on the Allotment? Because I love coriander, it's one of my favourite herbs.
Yeah.
And every time I sow it, the slugs eat it before I can. Every time.
Do they?
And they leave this one alone. So that's why I've got quite dependent on it.
Yeah. This is a plant I really love, Telbagia, and I use it a lot in the kitchen.
Right.
But we use the leaves and the flowers. It's called society garlic. Do you know why it's called society garlic?
No.
Because apparently you get that garlic flavour, but it doesn't stay on your breath, so you don't smell. I'll grab the Welsh onions. I love sort of just using the leaves and cutting them like sort of giant chives.
Yeah.
Right.
How are you feeling about it?
I
You
like
happy
that.
with the
Looks
arrangement?
good, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it looks good.
I'm going to get a couple of buckets of water, I think, just to
Yes.
dunk things in as we plant, maybe.
Give a soak.
Yeah. What's lovely about this as well, it's not just, that we're going to use them edible-wise, but, the wildlife, the pollinators are going to come in and...
Be attractive,
Yeah.
isn't it? And then they'll obviously pollinate all your raspberries and everything else.
Yeah, so it'll work really nicely. Cool, so that's that one done.
Right, yes. We're getting there.
Here we are. It's already looking good.
I'll grab the water.
Yeah,
I
brilliant.
think they might need some.
I think so, even with dipping them, it's quite warm, isn't it? Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, Adam.
Thank you. It's been really nice, Leslie, just to sort of, well, first of all, just show you around.
Well, it's been lovely to come and see the garden and to help out, actually. But you must come down the Allotment one day because I have plenty of projects. It's always needing an extra pair of hands.
Do you know, I'd love to. It'd be really nice. Now, Rachel has been to Gloucestershire, to Kifsgate Court, to find out a little bit more about the 3 generations of women that have created the garden over the last 100 years.
Winding woodland terraces, meandering borders, a series of small gardens, each with their own individual personalities. It's a joyful place to be. But it's the story of the women behind Kifsgate that's really captured my imagination. 3 generations of women spanning a century, each of whom adding to the story that's made this garden possible. The first of this trio of gardeners was Heather Muir, who established the garden layout after the First World War. She wasn't a trained gardener, but she definitely had her own ideas. Her vision was create a relaxed and natural style, totally different to the regimented style of the day. This square is divided into 4 sections. I can't tell you, it really takes your breath away when you walk down into it. And I think Heather had such a talent for putting together colours. They really flow. And she also was very much, I think, ahead of her time in that she mixed together shrubs with perennials. At the beginning of the 20th century, most people would have had a shrubbery and then a separate herbaceous border. So this was really ahead of its time. It is absolutely beautiful, rather like falling into a box of chocolates and finding something delicious in it. Then in this area, you walk past more of Heather's beautiful planting, past the hybrid musk rose called Felicia, the fantastic perfume, and that was planted in the 1930s. And then you come out into this section, and wow, what a view. Today, her granddaughter Anne, together with her husband, has taken the reins and embraced her grandmother's vision. Your grandmother sounds extraordinary and very much her own woman.
Yes, I think she was. My mum always said that she had a very strong character. In fact, we've all got rather strong characters. She really planned the garden without putting anything on plan, just by looking at the space, planting the hedges, dividing up the areas, and that's pretty remarkable, really.
And where did that inspiration come from?
I think she'd grown up in a garden. Her parents were keen gardeners, so maybe it was in the blood. She'd had no horticultural experience. None of us have, so she just had to learn on the job.
Yes, best way of learning.
Yeah, well, I think. Yes, you learn with your mistakes.
Now we're walking along this avenue of Rosamunde, just so beautiful, I can't describe.
This was planted by my grandmother, this rose hedge, so way back in the 1930s, and she cut it very hard, and we do as well. She used to take shears to it and literally just sort of chop it.
Which is how it's treated now, actually.
Yes.
Much more. People aren't so precious about
No, and it flowers incredibly well every year. You can see how we train the other roses on sort of different supports so that you get the best from the flowers.
Yes, that's lovely, isn't it? So you
yes.
bend the stem down and then it breaks.
Exactly,
along
rather than
to
just
get
let
the
them all
flowers.
grow in a sort of heap.
And of course, one can't help now but notice this most beautiful rose. I'm assuming Kivsgate.
Yes, it is. I mean, a complete monster, really, climbing to the top of the trees and covering a vast area. But it is spectacular when it's in flower like this. Sort of a waterfall of white heads.
It's just a sort of glorious monster. In 1954, Anne's mother, Diney, was lured back from London life by her grandmother, Heather, to take over the garden. This wonderfully sinuous border, I mean, it's a really interesting take on a very classic feature, usually straight lines. So who was responsible for...
Well, my grandmother laid out the border, and my mum actually added a lot to it as well. She was a great plants woman, absolutely adored gardening. I mean, as a child, I just sort of remember we couldn't find her. We knew she'd be upside down in the border somewhere, so we had to just sort of shout and find her. But she really spent hours in the garden. Summer flowering ceanothus, as against the evergreen blue ones that you know sort of in the spring, and that they actually add a lot at this time of year. We don't prune them until the spring, just in case it's a bad winter. They seem to thrive here.
A great melding plant,
yes.
You know, sort of softens things
absolutely.
like the roses and
yes,
so on.
Very good
it.
sort of mixture
yes.
with the roses. Then, of course, here, the little bush honeysuckle, and it just grows into that sort of small bush shape. It's not a climber. And people always sort of comment, how do you keep your honeysuckles that shape? But it just does it.
Anne followed in her mother and grandmother's footsteps, putting her own mark on the garden. She's created wilder areas because she's very keen to bring in nature, which feels very different to the established gardens. And there's something else. Oh my goodness. Wow. Just when you're beginning to feel you've got the measure of Kivsgate, something completely happened? Is this Anne in the garden?
Well, it's me and Johnny, my husband, because he helped do the plans for this. And we wanted something very simple and contemporary. We had the lovely big yew hedges, and then we also decided that we needed some height. But we liked the simplicity of the stainless steel stems and the gilded bronze philodendron leaves, and the water just runs up them on a sort of timer.
It's such a lovely contrast to the rest of the garden. Do you feel that you've had an enormous responsibility in inheriting this incredible garden?
Yes, I mean, when Johnny and I first moved down, we really knew nothing. We had to learn from my mother. It's been our life, really, for 30 years, and we've loved it.
One garden, 3 female gardeners, each putting their own unique stamp on it, all uniting in the vision of a place where plants and spaces can blend and flow in perfect harmony.
That really is an incredible garden. I love the way each generation has just added a little bit of them. You can imagine just walking through those herbaceous and rose gardens and arriving at that new area with the bed heading and tying in. I mean, this rose itself has been on a bit of a voyage. We inherited it. It was in a mess. It was full of old dead wood, and we were quite harsh. Cut it really back in hard, kept a couple of stems, but then kept adding lots of organic matter in around just to feed it. And this year, boom, it's really been incredible. I'm just going to keep dead heading now, just so it keeps flowering. And then on top of that, just tying in some of the shoots, because for me, I love the way that actually it's hanging. It feels quite romantic. Now we go back to Arit at Landshark Park in Germany to find out a little bit more about that fascinating place.
Walking around the landscape park, it's remarkable to think that up until 1985, this was an ironworks that was then abandoned and left to decay. Thanks to the vision of landscape architect Peter Latz, this industrial landscape is now the unique backbone to over 400 acres of parks, gardens, waterways and green space. This is Piazza Metallica, and I think you can see why. These huge, enormous great slabs that were found in the foundry, Peter has repurposed them to create this open terrace in amongst all of the architecture. And what I really love about it is that you're almost in some sort of theatre set. I know that people have events here, and I could really see why. It's just genius. While it was Peter Latz who designed the park, he was supported by several community groups who were passionate about preserving their industrial heritage and reclaiming the land as a people's park. Through the creation of the landscape park, their dream was realised. And today, judging by how busy this place is, there is something here for everyone. I'm intrigued to know why you come to the park.
Oh, it's one of my favourite places, actually. I live nearby. My family background is miners and steel workers. This is one of the few places left where you can actually see what it looked like 20, 30, 50, 40 years ago.
Are you glad that they've preserved this space?
Yes, it's very special because it's a part of the history of the area. I've been here with my children. We, climbed up that big
furnace?
Yes, and everything. So it's really special, and it's really important for the area to keep, spaces like that.
Wish I could come every day myself.
Yes.
What brings you to the park today?
We studied some sketches.
What do you think of what you've seen so far?
I like it really much, like this old industrial area where the nature popped in and did what it's used to be, like don't care about the buildings. I like how the nature find its way through it. I think it's beautiful like this.
Yeah. Nature really has taken hold since this park first opened 25 25 years ago. Let's remember, none of these trees would have been at this height. None of this would have been grown over at all because obviously the boundary was still pretty derelict. These great big girders are covered in all of this greenery. This is nature completely enveloping it. Underneath all of these layers there will be biodiversity that wouldn't have been able to have survived here if this foundry was still working. It would be still billowing out loads of smoke. So this is absolutely archetypal for me of how we bring nature into our built environment. Across this 400-acre site, there are all kinds of different green spaces. Dr. Peter Carl, who monitors nature in the park, has brought me to a wild meadow on the site of the Ironworks colliery to explain how a place of such intense industry could turn into a rich habitat.
Wir haben ganz unterschiedliche Böden, ganz unterschiedliche.
We have a great variety of different soils here. We've got rubble.
Wir haben
We've got mining materials from the colliery.
Aus der Zeche, deswegen wachsen auch unterschiedliche
That's why we have different plant species growing in different areas.
Arten an unterschiedlichen Stellen.
I'm interested to know how much was here originally versus how much you may have slightly intervened with.
Es ist ganz wenig ursprünglich.
Hardly anything was originally planted, apart from the old trees that are still here.
Hier noch stehen die Platanen, die
The wild plants we can see here, especially the herbs and perennials, they all came here by themselves.
sind alle von alleine gekommen.
Nothing was planted at all.
Gepflanzt, jede
Each plant managed to find its way into the park on its own.
Park geschafft.
Tell me specifically about some of the plants that are here that make it different to anywhere else.
Das ist ein
This is a special place where we've got plants that wouldn't naturally grow in an ordinary park.
Parkanlage natürlich nicht vorkommen. Zum Beispiel
For example, the Echium vulgare, which comes from the floodplains and is settled here from dry meadows.
den mageren Wiesen kennen.
But dry meadows have become very rare now here in the Ruhr region. So that's why this habitat is so important.
In terms of the amount of species of insects that have come to this park, how important are they?
Der Park hat eine
The park is incredibly important for urban biodiversity in the Ruhr region.
Universität hier im Ruhrgebiet. Wir
We
kennen
know an awful lot about insect decline in Europe,
Europa sehr
and this place is really a refuge for wild plants and insects.
für wildlebende Pflanzen und Tiere und diese Artenvielfalt
And the variety of plants attracts the many insects we have,
bringt natürlich auch die
like bees,
Standortvielfalt, die Pflanzen-
butterflies, moths,
Wir haben die Wildbienen,
but also the beetles
die Nacht-
and the ants you can find here in the park.
die Käfer und die Ameisen,
That's basically the food source for these insects.
die Nahrungsgrundlage für diese Tiere. Das ist schon
That's pretty special.
Natur,
Nature for nature and nature for the people.
Menschen.
What's happened here is that nature has been remembered and allowed to come in all of its wildness with minimum formality, and that's what makes this place so special. In the future, with our cities ever expanding, it's going to become even more vital to build green spaces into our urban environments for our health and well-being. Is it time to take inspiration from this landscape park and think again about our own industrial landscapes, not as decaying places to be forgotten, but areas where we can thrive?
Wow. Think 25 years ago, the creation of that park must have been so forward-thinking. I loved the wildflower meadow. But also a couple of weeks ago, we made the wildflower programme, and your reaction has been amazing. We really do seem at a point where we're understanding These resources, the natural landscape, are so important to us. And water is another one. I suppose as a designer, I love coming up with creative but fun ideas. These were left over from a show. Brought them home, put some plants in. They've worked well for the greenhouse. I can come out and dunk pots in. Then they're a wildlife habitat. The birds have come in and used it, naturally seeded. So as the tanks fill and the water it overflows and it's going off and feeding what ultimately is another habitat. If you were thinking about sitting down this weekend and having a rest, here's a few jobs that might just stop that. To keep your salad going through the summer, so rock it now. Fill a pot with peat-free compost. Smooth off the surface and water it well. Before you sprinkle on the seeds, make sure not to sow too thickly. Cover the seeds lightly and water gently. If you keep it somewhere shady, you'll be picking it for weeks. As gardeners, we are always planning for next year. And a good thing to do is to take stock of what's happening right now. Mark up any plants that you want to move or divide later by putting in a cane next to them. Make sure you label the cane so you know what you need to do with it. I also take a few photographs to remind me. Now's the time of year when lots of seed heads are starting to ripen. If you want to save some seed, keep an eye on your plants and make sure you catch them as soon as the seed heads open. On a dry day, cut the seed heads from your most vigorous plants and carefully place them in a labelled paper envelope. Put this somewhere cool and dry until it's time to sow. This is what we all should do a little bit more of. Just sit for 5 minutes at the end of the day, enjoy the sun on your back. You can smell the scent in those roses and listen to the wildlife. What could be more wonderful? That's about it from us. I hope you've had a lovely time, because I definitely have. But next week, Monty will be back at Longmeadow on Friday at 8:30. Bye-bye.
And if you're just discovering your green fingers, try Gardener's World, the Veg Growers Almanac. Planting tips aplenty. Stay put next here on 2. We go beneath the surface to delve deep into the world of the hippo, utterly dependent on water, yet unable to swim. David Attenborough elaborates next.